Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on understanding popular culture, today we'll talk about Indian cinema, mapping the influence of the national struggle for independence. As all of us are aware that how cinema is an important part of the popular culture in the way the films they have been made since the arrival of cinema from 1896 onwards in India with the arrival of the cinematograph, and thereafter how we have seen that the silent cinema period, where a number of films which did not have the kind of dialogues which we have from 1931 onwards, when the first talkie film came. So even during the silent cinema, the various kinds of themes on which films they were being made, whether the mythologicals or devotionals, etc. So how cinema was connected to the popular culture, how it was trying to communicate the kind of ideas which were closely related to culture, and at the same time, as we are aware that the India's struggle for independence at that point of time had entered into a new phase from 1885 onwards, and thereafter we see that the arrival of Gandhi, and thereafter when Mahatma Gandhi arrives in India in 1915, and thereafter the national struggle for independence entered a new phase. So in that context, when we try to understand the popular cinema, that how the films they were connected to the national struggle for independence, where many a times not only the themes of the films they were trying to communicate the ideals of the national movement, but at the same time the banners or the film studios, their names, they were also suggestive of the fact that they were being influenced by the national movement. So we, in the course of our discussion, we will try to talk about certain films and how these films they were trying to reflect or trying to communicate the ideals of the Indian national movement or India's struggle for independence, and at the same time we will try to also find out that how they were connected to the ideas of the popular culture, cinema as not only a medium of entertainment, but cinema also as a medium of communication, as a medium of education. So we'll try to see the arrival of cinema, the various kinds of genres on which these films they were being made, and how they were connected to the India's national movement at that point of time. In the context of the readings, you can see Gautam Kaul's Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle, Aruna Vasudev, Liberty and License in the Indian Cinema, S.T. Bhaskaran, The Message Bearers, The Nationalist Politics and the Entertainment Media in South India, 1880 to 1945, Feroz Rangoonwala, 75 Years of Indian Cinema. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about the cinema of the colonial period. And when we tend to understand the cinema of those times, we find that Indian cinema, it developed during one of the most active phases of the national movement. And it was also very natural that how cinema was also influenced by the ideals and the objectives of the freedom struggle. So when we tend to see these films, when we tend to understand those films within the background of the national movement, we realize that when these films they were interacting with the socio-political realities of that period. So in a way, Hindi cinema was influenced, as well as it was being influenced by the socio-political realities of those times. So this kind of a impact was a two-way kind of impact, where cinema was getting influenced by the socio-political realities, and at the same time it was also influencing those realities. So we have to in a way understand cinema or the films of that period in that particular context. We also have seen that how cinema tried to in a way portray the nationalist aspirations and the motives in the various kinds of films they were being made, and at the same time some of the national movement leaders they also tried to use cinema in the elections as well. They realized the importance of cinema as an instrument of propaganda, and leaders like Satyamurthy, they tried to in a way incorporate cinema in a way so that the political sphere and at the same time it could also be used to promote the message of a particular party. So we also find that how cinema in a way promoted various kinds of cultures, fashions and identity. It is closely related to that. And recently we also have seen that cinema can be used as an audio visual medium in terms of writing history. As new and new sources in history, they have been explored by the academicians, scientists, social scientists and historians. And when one can talk about the oral history, that how oral history is an important source of history writing, then why can't cinema, which is a documented source, it cannot be used in terms of writing history? And there is a lot of debate with regard to that. Some of the historians, they totally reject cinema as a source of historical inquiry, and there are others, those who say that its importance could be realized when one can situate and locate those particular films in a particular context. And when we talk about that how during the particular period of silent era, we find that filmmakers, when they were making those films and when they were making films on the devotional themes or on the mythological themes, and both these themes basically they were trying to communicate the earlier period where a lot of literature in the or a lot of poetry which was there, it could also be utilized in terms of making the films. And filmmakers like Dada Saheb Phalke, who is also known as the father of the Indian cinema, and Phalke made a number of films during this particular period, especially the mythological genre, where Phalke, beginning from Raja Harishchandra in 1913, he made several films. And when we talk about silent cinema, we also have to keep in mind that the films, they were being accompanied by the live musicians. The live musicians, they were sitting on the floor and they were trying to narrate the events which were being shown on the celluloid. And when you talk about the colonial period, we see that during this period there were a lot of restrictions from the colonial government, and the colonial government was in a way apprehensive of the kind of policies or the kind of tactics which were being used by the people, those who were against the colonial rule. And they wanted to throttle every kind of aspiration of the Indians in terms of achieving independence or bringing any kind of a resistance to their rule. And when we talk about the themes of the mythologicals, they were familiar to the audience, and their mythological and the religious character, it appealed to them. And we find that when these films, they were being made, they were dealing with the characters and the events which were taken from the past, from the epics and the scriptures, and they were trying to portray the interaction between the deities, demons and the supernatural powers. So the mythological films, they were being the stories, they were being taken from the past, and all these stories, they were known to the audience. And when one did not have the dialogues in the films, so knowing the story was some sort of a bonus where the story could be easily understood. And at the same time, the live musicians, those who were there, they made it comparatively more easier when they were trying to narrate what was happening on the screen. And we also see when the deities they appeared on the screen and they performed the miracles, and when the illiterate spectators, they saw these kind of miracles, they were happening in front of them, then they prostrated themselves and taking these deities as the real deities. And this could also be related when one sees that how the actors of the television serial like Ramayana and Mahabharata, which were made in 1980s and early 90s, and how these actors, they were treated to be real gods and goddesses, and how these people, they became very popular. And we are talking about 1980s and 90s, which is comparatively a recent period. But when you talk about 1910s and 20s and 30s, during that period when all sorts of technology was not available, people, they were not all that literate, and when they saw these kinds of miracles in cinema itself was a new kind of arrival, some kind of a technology's child, and it was a new child that way. And when they saw these kinds of images on a screen, that how these images they were being moving, so it created a lot of impact on the masses, and they remained surprised as what all was happening on the screens. And when they saw the real the people, those who were working in the cinema as gods and goddesses, and when they saw them even in the real life, they considered them to be the real people that way. And the kind of devotion which they exhibited to these screen deities was phenomenal even in the 1980s as well as in the 1990s. We also see that apart from the mythological films which were made during this time, and how these mythological films, for example Raja Harishchandra, as I told you, by Dada Saheb Phalke, and how Raja Harishchandra, where he is considered to be a votary of truth, and how the national movement in the framework of Gandhi could be, the idea of satyagraha could be related to the kind of policies or the kind of beliefs which Raja Harishchandra had. So these kind of parallels they could be drawn at that point of time, and people could also see during this period that how the ideals of the national movement they were being reflected in certain films of those times. We also see that some of the films like Tulsidas, Surdas, Tukaram, which were based on the lives of various saints, etc., and how these saints they were performing various kinds of tasks, and it was being exhibited that they were endowed with power, and with that power they were able to perform certain miracles, and how their lives and the teachings they influenced masses, and how these people they were held in great reverence by the common masses. So such kind of films, apart from mythologicals, the devotional films, they also had a lot of reverence in the eyes of the people, those who were watching such kind of films. And we also find that the spectators they in a way exhibited an infatuation with the myth, with the devout worship of the gods and goddesses. They had this kind of a faith in the divinity for performing the miracles. And at the same time we also find that how the colonial rulers they followed a strict censorship policy, and because of which we find many films of the socio-political nature they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And as we are aware that filmmaking is a costly kind of a business where a lot of money is being invested. So the producers they had this kind of a fear that they will lose their capital, and so they had to invest their capital in a wiser manner. And if they will invest their capital in the films which were to be rejected by the censors, then they will not be able to recover their costs. So they in a way were not ready to make films of the socio-political nature, and that is why they were not ready to depart from the kind of mythological themes in which they were being engaged in the initial part, and they did not want to venture into the other themes. And we can also see that when we are talking about the kind of a cinema, the cinema which was in the framework of Raja Harishchandra, which was based on a story from Mahabharata, and we also see that how such kind of films they were also in a way related to the growing national consciousness of the people, and the popular legends of the gods and goddesses which were being portrayed on the celluloid, they provided an oblique affirmation of the national sentiments against the threatened domination of an alien culture. So this kind of an idea where the gods and goddesses they were being shown, and how they were being connected to the national sentiments in a way, and they were in a way also reflective that how alien culture which was in a way imposed by the Britishers, so it had a lot of threat to the Indian culture. and the introduction of the English language, the introduction of the Western dresses, or other kinds of food and other kinds of mannerisms which were there with the British, and how Indians they were in a way trying to follow those kinds of cultural beliefs that way. And these kinds of portrayals, which were in a way connected with the mythological stories, they were trying to communicate that the Indian sentiments, they were comparatively different from the sentiments of the British. And we also see that how the various mythological films which were made during this time, they were trying to in a way portray the ideals and the values which were needed for the social regeneration. And as I told you earlier, that how the life story of Raja Harishchand, it held in a way parallel to the philosophy of Satyagraha, and how to endure suffering with faith in the ultimate victory of good over evil. So we find that not only courage but also the spirit of selfless sacrifice was needed to fight the British, and this kind of selfless sacrifice could only be achieved when people, they had innate belief in what they were doing. And when we try to understand the situation, we see that this kind of an atmosphere of anti-imperialism, the mythologicals, they were interpreted as the symbolic representations of the struggle against the tyranny of the colonial rule. And this kind of a feeling of anti-imperialism, where they had to fight with the colonial rulers, and they had to in a way struggle against the tyrannical rule, it was in a way reflected in some of the films of those times. And one of the journalist turned filmmakers, K. Abbas, he says that when you see a film which was based on the life of Lord Krishna, then Lord Krishna's struggle against the tyrant Kans could strike a patriotic note of defiance in the heart of the people, those who are going to watch the films. And when Lord Krishna talks about the bad judgment, misrule, oppression and tyranny of Kansa, it was also suggestive of the colonial oppression and misrule. So these kind of parallels, they could be drawn even from the mythological stories. When Lord Krishna is talking about Kansa, then he was also trying to communicate the kind of attitude which was being exhibited by the British government. And we see that the ideas of oppression, misrule, tyranny, they were there during the colonial rule as well. So these kind of parallels could be seen during this particular period. And we also find that how various films like Sarandri, it exposed the regime of Lord Curzon. In Dharmatma in 1935, untouchability problem was highlighted, and Gopal Krishna, which was made in 1938, was also dealing with the rule of a despot. So we see that these kinds of films, they were trying to use mythology as in a way in a framework of allegory, and they were trying to communicate a meaning which was more contemporary in nature, which was in a way related to the oppressive colonial rule. And the people, they could be exposed to such kind of ideas when they were watching such kind of mythological cinema. And we also see in many of the devotional films, for example, Sant Tukaram, which was made in 1936, or Rajarani Meera, Chandidas, Sant Gyaneshwar, Bhakt Kabir, all of these films, they were trying to in a way show some kind of a humanist and the reformist approach in their ideas, and they could very well be understood in the framework of the oppressive British rule in India. We also see that many a times women which were they did not have that kind of freedom in those times, and they were not being allowed to go out, and but for the mythological cinema, they were being allowed to go and watch the mythological films, and when they went out to see these films, we find that there was a lot of socialization of women when they came into contact with other women, those who also went to see such kind of films. And when the news topicals which were in a way accompanying these bhakti films, they were shown in a way to these women, those who went out to watch films, and where they could see many of the leaders of the Congress party or other political formations at that point of time, and how these political formations, they were seeking the participation of women in the national movement. So this kind of a message, it was being debated at home, that why the participation of women in the national movement was very, very important, and how they should in a way try to give their more time. And we also see that many of the leaders, they also wanted women to participate in the national movement. And when women, they will also participate in the national movement, so it will also mean that the entire house, even children, they will be acquainted with the ideals of the national movement. And many leaders like Sister Nivedita, Annie Besant, Sarojini Naidu, when they moved out in public as the representatives of their gender in the freedom struggle, then the social barriers, they were a bit relaxed. So in this framework, we see that it created that kind of an impact on women, where women, they could get some kind of a reprieve or some kind of a relaxation in terms of the kind of rigid barriers which were being imposed on them. Because when they saw these leaders in the public sphere, and they realized the importance of the national movement, they also realized the importance of these women leaders and their contribution in that sense, and also the realization of the fact that if they will in a way contribute to the national movement in terms of their own participation in the national movement, so that will be some kind of a bonus to the India's struggle for independence. Apart from that, we also see that many other films which were based on other themes, they for example, the films which were based on the historical ideas, and how the films which were in a way considered as the historical films, and the background of the historical film, it in a way provided an opportunity to present the visual splendor and the richness of the palatial forts, processions, costumes, and the war scenes. So we find that historical films, they were being associated in that way, that how they had to present the visual splendor of those times. And at the same time, they had also to exhibit the richness of that particular period, whether in the framework of the costumes or in the framework of the buildings of those times, and the way the war scenes, they were also being shot. And we find that some of the films like Udaykal or The Thunder of the Hills in 1930, which was based on the life of Maratha warrior Shivaji, was a clever allegory on the overthrow of the foreign rule. And this film was originally titled Swaraj Toran, Flag of Freedom 1930, but censors, they revised its content and the title to suit the colonial regime. Apart from that, there was a film called Pukar, which was made in 1939, and it was an excellent dramatization of some of the semi-historical episodes in the life of justice-loving Mughal Emperor Jahangir, and how the idea of Hindu-Muslim unity was also woven in this film. So we find that apart from that, some other films, for example, Sikandar, had the release of the film coincided with the Second World War, and in India the political atmosphere was very tense during this time, following the Gandhi's call for the civil disobedience, and it aroused a lot of patriotic feelings and the national sentiments among the masses. And British government also became in a way alarmed because of this, and how its screening was banned in many cantonment areas, because when Porus talks about driving out the aliens from Bharatvarsha, it would also be understood as a reference to the British. So we talked about basically the mythological genre and the genre of the devotionals as well as the historicals, and the ideas which were associated during how these films they were associated with the ideas of the national movement at that point of time. We'll talk about further films, some other films of this particular period, and the various kinds of ideas which were associated with these films in our next lecture. Thank you very much.